Well, hello there. How is everyone? I suck. My eyes. I hate hay fever. I hate hay fever. But because I love you guys and you're all amazing, I'm going to go through this document with you. And the reason I'm going through this document before people start moaning is because a lot of people ask me to. I appreciate other people have done it. Jules, I believe she has gone through it. There's loads of other people, but some people just don't have these dulcet tones. But anyway, it's a long document, so let's get straight into the meat and potatoes, shall we? And just ignore the fact that I look a bit like a crackhead. I hope this isn't going to keep bleeping all the way through this. Right, let's learn how to use this, shall we? Right, so we've got, this is the state's objection to state's motion for protective order. And this is an interesting read, and we're going to be reacting to it as we go through it. And you're probably going to be reacting as well if you haven't already seen this. So on the 13th of November 2022, law enforcement responding to a 911 call found Madison Mogan, Kaylee Gonsalves, Xana Knodel and Ethan Chapin deceased. Law enforcement later found a K-bar knife sheath placed next to Ms. Mogan on her bed. The sheath was placed button side down and partially under Ms. Mogan and the comforter. On the 20th of November 2022, the Idaho State Police Lab in Meridian, Idaho, located DNA on the button of the sheath and performed STR analysis that led nowhere when ran through CODIS, which is Combined DNA Index System, other than to show the provider was a male, which simply means that they knew it was a male DNA, but they'd never committed a crime before that was recorded on this system. So, by December 17th, 2022, lab analysts were aware of 2 additional males' DNA within the house where the deceased were located, and another unknown male DNA on a glove found outside the residence on November the 20th, 2022. So, what we've got to think is here, so they're saying that lab analysts were aware of 2 additional males' DNA. So, they're in the house, they're unaware of who they are, but yet they only focus on one of what they're given, obviously. So what we're saying at this point is that when the DNA was given to that original lab, they weren't just given the knife sheath. They must have been given other articles that had that DNA on them that then brought up to. So what were the other items? What did they have? They're saying that one of these is a glove, but what I don't get here is that they're saying that they were aware of 2 additional males' DNA within the house where the deceased were located. So there must have been other items sent in for testing, like the sheath would have been sent in, something else would have been sent in. The glove was obviously sent in. That was the one that Chris McDonut found. Anyway, let's move along. To this date, the defence is unaware of what sort of testing, if any, was conducted on these samples other than the STR DNA profiles. Further, these 3 separate and distinct male DNA profiles were not identified through CODIS, leading to the conclusion that the profiles do not belong to Mr. Kohberger. So let's just do that again. Further, these 3 separate and distinct male DNA profiles were not identified through CODIS, leading to the conclusion that the profiles do not belong to Mr. Kohberger. So what they're basically saying is, they still don't know who these are. It was never tested to say that these other DNA samples do belong to Bryan. So we can only assume that because your paperwork, if you like, doesn't show who they are and doesn't say that they're Bryan's, then they can't be his. While this was ongoing, police were investigating many various possible suspects. Many of them provided DNA. At least one had his DNA surreptitiously taken from a discarded cigarette. Many also had their phones taken and downloaded. One area of the investigation had to do with a white sedan. So we'll get back onto this, but what they're basically saying is, so everybody from sort of you would expect to have their DNA taken was taken. So there is still unknown DNA that hasn't been, even these months down the track. Yeah, I see what they're getting at. They're getting at the fact that they're just, at the moment, they're focusing on one element when it could have been more. And what have we always said? That we've always felt that Bryan could have been involved, but could he have done it on his own? Could he have done it on his own? And lo and behold, we have this statement. If it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck. That's what they say, don't they? One area of the investigation had to do with a white sedan seen on camera located at 1112 King Road, first glimpsed by officers on November 18th, 2022. By November 25th, 2022, police believed the car to be a white Elantra and asked law enforcement to be on the lookout for one. Precisely how the police came to believe the car was an Elantra is still unknown. A report from an analyst for the FBI dated March 21st, 2023 shows the analyst heavily relying on a video of a car heading in the wrong direction and at the wrong time on Ridge Road, which we've always said that picture that I used to say that this could be a white Hyundai Elantra. This is what they were using, but many people did point out that the car was heading the wrong way, which moves more in line with the original timeline that they originally came out and said was this happened between, 3 and 4, which would have not then enabled it to fit in with Kohberger. Everything seems to have then shifted forward to cater for his car, or not even his car, the things like his phone being switched off. Do you know what I mean? The state's latest filing admits that somewhere within all of this, they engaged in investigative genetic genealogy. See how I can get there? Using the DNA taken from the button on the sheath, and now claims that it was due to the use of this technique that it tipped local law enforcement to investigate Mr. Kohberger. It remains unclear what the police first relied on in focusing their investigation on Mr. Kohberger. No matter what came first, the car or the genetic genealogy, the investigation has provided precious little. There is no connection between Mr. Kohberger and the victims. There is no explanation for the total lack of DNA evidence from the victims in Mr. Kohberger's apartment, office, home, or vehicle. In essence, through the lack of disclosure and their motion to protect the genetic genealogy investigation, the state is hiding its entire case. The argument, there we go. The state apparently thinks that they do not explain, or they do not need to explain, how they came to think it was Mr. Kohberger's DNA on the sheath. Presumably, the defence is expected to accept at face value that the sheath had touched DNA just waiting for testing by all the FBI's myriad resources. Additionally, the defence is to guess whether the state focused its investigation on Mr. Kohberger via a bizarrely complex DNA tree experiment or through its faulty identification of the vehicle involved in this case. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Mr. Kohberger does not accept that his defence does not need this information. It rather obviously falls within the ambit of Rule 16b, 4 and 5, a fact the state's briefing makes clear in its kitchen sink approach to their briefing. The state begins their argument claiming Rule 16 has no interest in IgG testing, and then ends their argument claiming that somehow people will stop sharing their genetics if they were to realise the government is watching. Both arguments must fail. To begin with, the state apparently only wants to prevent Mr. Kohberger from seeing how the IgG profile was created and how many other people the FBI chose to ignore during their investigation. In essence, the state argues that if the later STR testing is accurate, then there is no reason to concern ourselves with how the state came to investigate Mr. Kohberger. State's brief at 9. What the state's argument asks this court and Mr. Kohberger to assume is that the DNA on the sheath was placed there by Mr. Kohberger and not someone else during an investigation that spans hundreds of members of law enforcement and apparently at least one lab the state refuses to name. Perhaps most puzzling is the state's argument that while Rule 16b-5 requires them to turn over the results or reports from scientific investigations, it does not require the state to disclose what law enforcement does with the results or reports. State's brief at 14. First of all, that sounds like an admission that the information as to how the IgG was carried out should be disclosed. Second, what law enforcement does with results or reports is covered by Rule 16b-6, statements of prosecution witnesses, and 8, police reports. Frankly, the fact that members of the FBI are so concerned about permitting Mr. Kohberger to know what they were up to with what was supposedly his DNA does not give one the impression that there is nothing to see here, as the state seems to imply. Finally, the state's claim that ICR 16.2 applies to this matter is quite bizarre. Presumably, the independent company the government relied on was paid for its work and would stand by it in a court. The state provides no real argument as to why the company needs to be protected. Mr. Kohberger is left to suspect they wish to keep their methods from being questioned, to the extent that there is some concern or intellectual property that can be addressed via a protective order that permits Mr. Kohberger and his defense team to review their work. See, e.g. State versus Pickett. Goes on to go on about another case. Second, the state appears to argue that everyone living on Earth that provides genetic information is A, unaware that their DNA could be used by a government somewhere for something, and B, is an informant within the meaning of the term in the rule. The state citations to cases involving actual informants hardly help it make it a credible leap. No court has ever found the existence of a DNA informant. It would appear that the state is acknowledging that the companies are providing personal information to the state and that those companies and the government would suffer if the public were to realise it. The only two databases that allow access are ones that already inform their users, and those users can opt in to allow law enforcement searches. The statement by the government implies that the databases searched may be ones that law enforcement is specifically barred from, which explains why they do not want to disclose their methods. So they're trying to attack, this fruit of the poisonous tree. They could potentially point to the fact that they obtained some of their evidence in a way that they shouldn't. Was an issue. Then the state's very public acknowledgement of such investigations was clearly a big mistake. In any case, it is hard to understand why Mr. Kohberger should be the one to suffer, because these companies and our government choose to either mislead or not educate the public. According to the Pew Research Center, in February 2020, 48% of respondents through it was acceptable to give their data to law enforcement to solve crime. 33% said no, and 18% were unsure. James Halpin, police use of forensic genealogy tech raises privacy concerns. The Citizen's Voice, March 28-22, available at... So these are where they get their statistics from. However, 60% thought their genetic information could not be shared with other companies. There is no federal law about the sharing of genetic information, but multiple states have begun regulating police use. I see also Lindsay Van Ness, DNA databases are boon to police but menace to privacy, critics say. State line February, and that tells you where they got that. Mr. Kohberger has reasons to be extremely suspicious of the IgG used in this case. Rather than seeing it as some sort of complex tree building that led to him, it appears far more like a lineup where the government was already aware of who they wanted to target, which is exactly what I said, rather than have the investigation done by someone blind to that fact. The FBI chose to do it themselves. This is akin to the police pulling in Mr. Kohberger and 5 of his cousins off the street and then pointing at him. The only authority the state has in its favour that is on point is a trial court order from a Californian case that settled before it could lead anywhere. That decision relied on is People versus Johnson, and it goes about this other case. We're keenly aware the cases we have discussed involve instances concerning fry hearings and potential expert testimony, and that here we are dealing instead with eyewitnesses who have already identified the perpetrator, and the identification found admissible under Wade. However, the facts of this case convince us defendant will be deprived of due process if he does not have access to the raw materials integral to the building of an effective defence. What do we got here? I think this is just regarding that case. Which I don't want to read that. Mr. Kohberger finds himself in a similar person to Ortega. A massive investigation came to focus on him and him alone. The state appears to be trying to hide its original domino such that he cannot discover why. Mr. Kohberger has a right to discover and question the investigation that led to him. This court should so find. And I think that's absolutely spot on. We've always said that, haven't we? Do you know what I mean? They're trying to hide the very information that put him in the firing line. No pun intended. But there we go. That was that document. What do you think? What do you think? Do you know what? I think it was... I can't even remember who it was. Was it... the saying is freedom of speech, isn't it? Some people's idea, I think it was Winston Churchill. He said, some people's idea of free speech is that they can say what they want as long as nobody says anything back. Or when somebody says something back, then it's classed as an outrage. And that's the same in this. Do you know what I mean? Some of you think that Bryan Kohberger is completely guilty. You know, sending him down a river already. And that's your prerogative to do so. But you can't kick off, because that's your opinion, when we have an opinion that differs from yours. And do you know what I mean? Some people just won't take everything at face value. Some people won't just accept that what is being fed to them is the full story. And you guys out there, even those who think that Bryan Kohberger is guilty, you should be thankful for people like me, people that do want to question stuff. The next time you get on an aeroplane and go flying to fucking wherever it is you holiday to, think to yourself why you're sitting on that plane, why you're able to, because somebody questioned the laws of physics and were able to get a plane together, the Wright brothers, and get you on an aeroplane. When next time you've got electricity or an iPad you're listening to or you're watching this, without people questioning things, without people pushing the boundaries of things, nothing gets done. And I think there's been enough that's happened in the past, in history, for us to truly accept that we do have to question. And in this case, reading through this doc, that first bit of this doc, we have even the people, like, I've never said that I believe that Bryan Kohberger is 100% innocent. I have always stated that I believe that he was involved in something somewhere along connected to this property, but what I struggle with is how this guy, all on his own, managed to do this crime. But this is the first time that I have even considered the fact that he may not be anything to do with this whatsoever. And the thing that makes me believe that is that this original timeline that came out, and it seems that at some point they shifted that time focus onto another time, and they did that to fit in with Bryan Kohberger. And I believe they did it to fit in with potentially his phone being switched off and not being able to locate him, thinking that he wouldn't then be able to tell people where he was, and there would be a bit of a conundrum. But I'm not 100% sure. I'm still sort of acutely aware that he could be involved, and there could be other people involved. Bryan Kohberger's not going to make himself look guilty, and he obviously can't make himself look guilty by dropping other people involved in it. But DNA, this far down the track, that they still don't know who it is. Why is there any DNA there that was in that house that they can't find? Now, don't get me wrong, it could be someone from way ago, and obviously these aren't the only people who have been in this house, and that could, but really, DNA around there, in the glove outside, even the Chris McDonagh glove. Make that make sense. Hit me up down below, let me know what you think. And Court Tuesday, what's going to happen? I'll catch you all in the next one.